Welcome to Mixie Veteran Stories, where untold sacrifices, forgotten salutes, and silent heroes finally get the spotlight they deserve. Today's story takes place in a crowded airport terminal. Among the rush of boarding calls, rolling suitcases, and fast-walking travelers, no one noticed the man in the wheelchair by gate 14. No one paused to ask who he was or what he carried on his lap. But when 47 Marines walked by, they didn't just notice him. They stopped, they knelt, and the airport would never forget what happened next. It was a Thursday afternoon at Charlotte Douglas International Airport. A sea of travelers shuffled past Gate 14, some late, some bored, most lost in their phones, and announcements buzzed overhead. Coffee cups steamed. Families hugged and parted. TSA officers moved briskly through the terminal. And near the windows, quietly, almost invisibly, sat an old man in a wheelchair. Wesley Wes Barrett, 92 years old. His coat was neatly buttoned, his USMC dress blues pressed with care. Medals gleamed faintly under the airport lights. A folded American flag rested across his lap, and beside it, a black and white photograph of a young man in uniform, faded at the edges but clearly loved. He wasn't waiting to board. He wasn't lost. He wasn't early or late. He was simply returning. Wes had just flown back from Washington, D.C., where after decades of silence, a long overdue name had been engraved onto a granite memorial wall. His best friend, Corporal Luis Moreno, had fallen in the Pacific in 1945. For decades, his name had been missing from official records due to a clerical oversight, and perhaps quietly because of the color of his skin. Wes had never let it go, and now, finally, he had stood before that wall, saluted the inscription, and promised to bring the flag back home, to the gravesite where Luis's family had waited 3 generations for someone to say, "We see him now." But no one in Gate 14 knew any of that. To them, he was just another elderly man in a wheelchair, an old uniform, a sentimental photo. Some probably assumed it was Veterans Day. A few looked at him, fewer said anything. Even the airline staff moved past him, not rudely, just routinely. And yet Wes didn't seem to mind. He watched the planes outside the window, his hands resting gently on the flag. His breathing was shallow, steady. His eyes 1,000 miles away, back in Iwo Jima, maybe, or Okinawa. Or that night in 1945 when Luis didn't come back. He wasn't waiting for applause. He wasn't hoping for recognition. He had made peace with silence a long time ago. What he didn't know, what no one knew, was that down the corridor, a group of Marines had just passed through security, and one of them had noticed the emblem on his chest. Wes Barrett hadn't planned on living this long. Most of the men he fought beside didn't. Most didn't get gray hair or grandchildren or a chance to sit by a window in a peaceful airport with polished medals on their chest. Wes knew this, and he carried it in his bones, quietly, without complaint. But there was one weight that never faded. Luis Moreno. The two met in boot camp in 1943. Wes was 19, Wes was 18, and from San Antonio, Texas. They were assigned to the same unit, trained together, fought side by side on islands that most people back home couldn't pronounce, and they survived everything, until they didn't. It was a night in 1940. A routine patrol turned into a nightmare. Mortar fire, screams, smoke so thick it felt like drowning. Luis had pulled Wes out of a crater after a shell landed nearby, dragging him across the jungle floor with a bullet in his own leg. They both made it back to camp that night, barely, but only one of them woke up the next morning. Luis died of internal injuries before dawn. Quietly, without drama, no fanfare, no medals, just silence. Wes had tried to write the letter to Luis's family, but the words never came. What do you say to someone whose son saved your life and got buried with only a first name listed on a form? Years passed. Wes returned home, tried to move on, married, had kids, became a mechanic, built a quiet life in rural Georgia. But he never forgot the boy from San Antonio with the bright grin and stubborn heart. He visited Luis's grave once in 1950, a small marker with just El Moreno etched into the stone. No rank, no flag, no mention of how he died or who he saved. That wasn't right. Wes promised himself he'd fix it one day. He wrote letters, filed paperwork, talked to senators and veteran groups. Most doors stayed closed. Some opened, only to ask for more documentation, more witnesses, more proof, as if friendship needed to be notarized. It wasn't until Wes's own grandson, an Iraq War veteran, stepped in that things started moving. A formal appeal was reopened, archives searched, witness records reviewed. Finally, after 77 years, the Department of Defense acknowledged Luis Moreno's sacrifice. His name was added to the Wall of Honor in Washington, D.C., in a quiet ceremony with a color guard, 3 chairs, and no cameras. Wes stood there alone in his dress blues. He saluted, and he wept. The folded flag was handed to him afterward, not for himself, but for Luis. Wes took the early flight home the next morning, determined to return that flag to the only piece of ground that ever held Luis's name. He would visit the grave one last time, place the flag, and say the goodbye he'd held back for a lifetime. That's why he was at Gate 14. Not because he was weak, not because he was stranded, but because he had one final mission and decades of silence wrapped in cloth across his lap. He didn't expect anyone to notice. He had already made peace with being forgotten. But that was about to change, because just down the corridor, 47 Marines in dress blues were slowing their pace. One of them had recognized the 4th Marine Division patch on Wes's shoulder and whispered, "Sir, I think that's one of them." Wes Barrett shifted slightly in his wheelchair, eyes half-lidded, lost in quiet thought. A final boarding call echoed overhead. He didn't hear it. All he heard was the ocean, distant, imagined, the way it sounded that night in 1945, after the mortars fell and the shouting stopped. He reached over and adjusted the photo on his lap. Luis, grinning in his too big helmet, the same photo he'd kept folded in his wallet for decades until it faded to sepia. He was preparing to close his eyes when the air around him changed. Not loud, not sudden, but still, different. Voices stilled, movement slowed, and from the corner of his vision, he noticed polished black boots lining the corridor, heading in his direction. 2 by 2, straight backs, metals gleaming, Marines, dozens of them. Wes blinked. He wasn't dreaming. He counted instinctively, 14, 20, then more, until a full platoon of 47 Marines in USMC dress blues had filled the space before Gate 14. They didn't speak, they didn't gesture, they simply stopped and faced him. Wes straightened slightly in his chair, unsure of what was happening. He reached for his cover, his white Marine cap, and slowly placed it on his head. Even after all these years, that motion still meant something. Then one of them stepped forward, a young first lieutenant, early 30s maybe, his jaw clenched and eyes already glassy. He raised his hand in salute, and in a single motion, every one of the 47 Marines dropped to one knee. Silence rippled through the terminal. Gate agents froze behind their desks. A child dropped her snack. A woman near the window gasped and covered her mouth. Even the TSA agents at the checkpoint stood frozen, watching history unfold in front of them. No one asked questions, because somehow everyone felt what was happening. Wes opened his mouth, but no words came. His lips trembled. His eyes darted across the sea of bowed heads in front of him. Young faces, strong bodies, polished brass and white gloves. And not a single sound. He wanted to say, "This isn't for me." But he couldn't, because he knew now it wasn't just for him. It was for Luis. For every name that didn't make it home. For every folded flag sent without ceremony. For every Marine who left footprints in places the world would never visit and never came back. And then, one Marine broke formation. A private first class, barely 20, walked slowly toward Wes, removing the insignia from his collar, his unit pin. With shaking hands, he knelt before Wes and offered it up. "Sir," he said, voice rough, "I know this doesn't make up for what was missed, but if you'd allow me, I'd be honored if you wore this back home." Wes looked at the boy, stunned. Then, with slow, practiced fingers, he reached forward and accepted the pin. He affixed it beneath his own medals, just below the silver star. Then he saluted back. And for the first time since 1945, he didn't feel like the last man standing. He felt like one of many again, a brother, a Marine. For 2 full minutes, no one moved. Not the passengers, not the gate crew, not even the janitor with his mop paused mid-step. And then the first clap rang out. Then another, and another, until the entire terminal was on its feet, applauding, cheering, saluting. Not for fame, not for a headline, but because 47 young men and women had reminded everyone what respect looked like when it meant something. West didn't cry, but his grip tightened on the flag. And in his mind he whispered, "They saw you, Luis. They saw both." The kneeling Marines didn't do it for cameras. But there was one. A woman sitting 2 gates over had started recording on instinct. Not for views, not for likes, just because her hands were shaking, and she didn't want to forget what she was seeing. She uploaded it that evening with the caption, "47 Marines just knelt in silence for an old man in a wheelchair. I don't know who he is, but I'll never forget him." By morning, it had 4.8 million views. By afternoon, over 12 million. And by nightfall, the name Wesley Barrett was trending across every major platform. But the story wasn't about him. It was about the photo in his lap, the name on the folded note, the face in that faded picture, Luis Moreno. News anchors scrambled for details. Veteran organizations began reaching out. Journalists searched military archives and found the records. PFC Luis Moreno, KIA 1945, unrecognized for decades. Letters poured in from across the country. People wanted to know, why wasn't he honored before? Why did it take 77 years? And who was this Marine who never let go of his friend's name? Within 48 hours, the story reached the White House. A formal statement was issued. Private First Class Luis Moreno served with distinction and died with honor. Though we failed to honor him in time, we will not fail to remember him now. The Department of Veterans Affairs announced that a memorial plaque bearing his full name, rank, and unit would be installed at Arlington National Cemetery. His family, still living in San Antonio, was flown in for the ceremony. But it wasn't just the government. People acted. A school in El Paso renamed their gymnasium Moreno Hall. A Texas university launched the Luis Moreno Scholarship Fund for first-generation military students. Dozens of Marine Corps veterans tattooed his initials beside the emblems of their units. Wes, for his part, stayed mostly quiet. He agreed to one short interview. The reporter asked him how it felt to finally be recognized. Wes shook his head. "It's not about me," he said. "It never was. The country saw a man in a wheelchair, but what they really saw was the Marine beside me who never got to come home." A week later, Wes received a hand-delivered envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter on White House stationery. It ended with a single line, "We should have knelt 77 years ago. Thank you for never standing down." It was a quiet morning when Wes Barrett arrived at the cemetery. No motorcade, no cameras, just a battered sedan with a Marine decal on the rear window and a folded flag resting gently on the passenger seat. The sky was overcast, soft with the kind of gray that made everything feel closer. He wheeled himself down the path alone, dressed once more in his USMC dress blues, every button polished, every step of the journey silent but sure. He reached the grave. The headstone had just been replaced. Now it read in full, PFC Luis Moreno, United States Marine Corps, Iwo Jima, 1945, he gave all. Wes set the brake on his chair, lifted the flag from his lap, and placed it slowly, carefully, at the base of the stone. He sat there for a moment, hands resting on his knees, the years written deep into his face. He didn't speak right away, but when he did, his voice was low, steady, just loud enough for the one person who mattered to hear. "They saw you, brother. The country saw you, and I kept my word, like I said I would." He adjusted the photo one last time, Luis's smiling face, now laminated and framed beside the flag, and saluted. It was slow, shaky, but perfect. Behind him, something stirred. Not a noise, not a person, just wind through the grass. A warmth that came not from sunlight, but from the weight of something fulfilled. A mission complete. Wes didn't stay long. He didn't need to, because he hadn't come to say goodbye. He had come to finish the promise, to walk the last few feet, so the name left behind could finally rest. And as he turned his chair and rolled back toward the car, a small group stood waiting. Not family, not press, just four Marines standing at ease, watching in silence. They didn't say a word. They didn't salute. They just stood there, making sure he didn't walk away alone.